Well, there's probably two now, so.
All right, good evening, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Max Walton. I have been to a lot of council meetings, board of adjustment meetings, planning commission meetings over the years. But I'm here not in that capacity. I am, I'm a private practice attorney and I represent government entities. And as part of that, I'm also a senior fellow at the University of Delaware's Institute of Public Administration. And one of the terrible things they make me do is teach FOIA and ethics at least 3 times a year. So I'm here to give you that. This is the boring subject that they asked me to teach. I'm going to go over tonight exactly the way I would do it for the university. So this isn't necessarily tailored to Newcastle. All the things are applicable, but it's something to do. So Antonina, if you get us started and get through the first couple of slides, go to the next one. We're going to do FOIA and ethics tonight. One more. Okay. What is the Freedom of Information Act? It only has 2 things. That's open meetings and it's got open records. And I'm going to go through these today, and I'll show you that there's a lot of what we call common law that impacts the Freedom of Information Act. That is Attorney General's opinions in this case, which dictates some things that may not make sense. So I'll try to point those out and go along. Next slide, please. Why do we have FOIA? Good question. The General Assembly has made a statement that it's vital in a democratic society that public business be performed in an open and public manner. So I don't care if you are on the Planning Commission, the Board of Adjustment, the Tree Commission, whatever it is, right? You're subject to open meeting requirements, and you're subject to, as with respect to your public business, your emails and your communications being public or being subject to a Freedom of Information Act request. Next slide, please. And the idea is that it's supposed to be, the idea is to keep society free, open, and democratic so you guys can monitor public officials. You guys are mostly public officials. What is the big thing in FOIA law right now? What is a public body? So we all know that the Planning Commission, Board of Adjustment, Council, those are public bodies, but there's all kinds of deviations from them. The definition of a public body is super broad. It means any board, bureau, commission, department, agency, temporary committee, advisory committee, subcommittee, legislative committee. Generally, you could take that to the nth degree, and that's anytime you get together, right? So there's a lot. Let's go to the next slide. So there is a little bit of that. So one of the things that I've been teaching against is that when you have these ad hoc committees, even if they're not governed by council, they could rise to the level of being a committee subject to FOIA. So that's not Antonina meeting with her staff, for example, or a member of the council, but it can be if it's done for a particular purpose. So in Leipzig, there is a museum review committee, the mayor, the council secretary, and the resident. And they said they weren't subject to FOIA because there was a less than a quorum group of people. And the Attorney General's office held them otherwise. They were appointed to a public purpose for review the museum. Dover had the mayor, city manager, assistant city manager, and the planning director got together to recommend to the council what to do with the old post office. Hell, that grouping of people was only consisted of the mayor as an elected. That was an official committee. Next slide, please. Christina School District, they said that when there were 2 individuals, board president, the board vice president, that met to negotiate a contract, they were impliedly a committee that was assigned to negotiate, therefore they were subject to FOIA. So they couldn't have non-public open meeting. So and a lot of times I get asked the question, where's the line on what is a grouping that is? There is no line. It's sort of a case-by-case basis. Now there's effects for the fire company here today. There is a FOIA decision that says the fire company is not subject to FOIA. So here's my next slide, please. So this is the 2-part test to determine whether a working group is a public body. First, does it fall within the statutory definition? We saw that that statutory definition is incredibly broad, so that's it. And, if the entity or the group impliedly or specifically charged, right, to make a reports, investigations, or recommendations. The only other escape hatch is you can refer. They said that's okay. But the big issue right now is whenever you're appointing somebody to do something, they're subject to FOIA. It's not difficult to comply with FOIA in that situation. So I won't get to it. What do you have to do? You have to post a notice. You have to have an agenda. You have to have minutes. All right. So every meeting of the public body shall be public, and the public, they can watch it, right? So so if there's a doubt about whether or not it's being public, the meeting is supposed to be held within the jurisdiction. That means you can go to Jessup's Tavern. We used to have meetings in Newark. You can notice a meeting that you can meet somewhere like that. We used to have them at Piedra or something like that, especially other committees, right? One of the things that you can't have, and council will be aware because I've said this many times, and they don't do this, but you can't have serial quorum issues. What's a serial quorum? Well, that's when people get together and attempt to subvert the Freedom of Information Act. So the famous case is a case out of, I think it was out of Milton. They were going to go buy a piece of property which they were going to look at to buy for like sewage treatment or something like that for a pump station. So what they did was they got 2 council members together and they went with the realtor and they went out to the property, 7 members of council, then the next 2 went out, and the next 2 went out, and 1 went out, right? So they were doing it to avoid having a meeting, they were supposed to do. And they said, well, that's a serial quorum. The other kind of serial quorum that we see very often is when members of a public body get on an email stream. All of our notices for meetings come from town hall. We're gonna have a meeting on this date. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What happens though, and not in Newcastle, but in other places, the folks on there will start discussing that particular thing. So the meeting agenda will go out, and I'll pick on Chris because I know he's in the Board of Adjustment in Newark. So let's say this is the Board of Adjustment in Newark. And so the meeting notice goes out and somebody says, item number 2 on the agenda, I don't know if they blank. And then the next person responds and they say, well, ultimately, I think that's okay because, well, guess what that's doing? That's discussing public business, not in the public body, but that's prohibited. That's a serial quorum. So you get the notice, and if it's just a notice or you say thank you or I will be there, that's not a serial quorum. It's when you're discussing the public business, it should be in public. That's when you have a serial quorum. Next slide, please. So you have to provide public comment for all meetings. So if it's the planning commission, the Board of Adjustment, the tree committee, who's going to plan the playground committee, whatever that might be, you have to allow public comment. Public comment does not mean that you have to allow everybody in the room to speak. Therefore, I will give you an example. I was in a Board of Adjustment case one time where there were 1,000 people. There were 1,000 people at this Board of Adjustment hearing. And everybody there wanted to speak. They all had an opinion on this particular thing. It was at Newark High School, I'll never forget it. The police chief had me look up in the rafters and said, that guy up there is spanning the crowd to make sure somebody doesn't shoot you. So if that guy says, get out of here, you have to get out of here. I was terrified the entire hearing. But I give that example because you don't have to allow all 1,000 people to speak. You can place time, place, and manner restrictions. How is that done? Well, you say, okay, we're gonna have up to an hour of public comment. Everybody's got 3 minutes if the room is full, and you can cut it off as reasonable time, place, and manner of restriction. It doesn't give everybody the right to comment. Next slide, please. And you guys allow comment off, and that's fine. I'm saying you can place reasonable time, place, and manner, right? This is what you have to do to have if you want to do a virtual meeting. Newcastle, to my knowledge, does not do virtual meetings, at least for council. They do have it on the Zoom. They don't allow participation by members of the public. This is if you decided to change that. We do it in Kent County, we do it in other places, but we don't do it here, and that's perfectly fine. If you do, you have to say, put it in the notice. There has to be an anchor location, which would be this spot. We're holding the meeting here. You have to be able to verify witnesses. People can't keep their screens black. They have to actually show their face and know who they are and put that in. Like, you can't have a Mickey Mouse face and sign in as Mickey Mouse. Next slide, please, which happens. You have to be able to hear the comments, right? And we had this during COVID. People would try to be doing presentations and they would pop something up on the screen for the council to look at. And then it would go away because we were in COVID and we couldn't come up with a record because we didn't have the document. So that's something you have to keep an eye on. So they do that. Next slide, please. Right? So you have to be able to monitor the public meeting. Public has to monitor public meeting and has to provide public comment. You have to give minutes. Next slide. So what happens when if you have a virtual meeting, all the council's here, the public's supposed to participate, and then the internet goes out? Well, I'll tell you what happens. The meeting goes on. Because the statute says, right, a technological problem that prevents or limits public access does not invalidate the virtual meeting. And I just had that for the first time at a very sophisticated jurisdiction. They went in, it was 3/4 of the way through the meeting. There were people who wanted to comment online. And I was like, we have to finish this meeting. The statute says, if there's a technological problem, we can move forward. And they did. So next slide, please. So an anchor location has to be in Newcastle. It can't be just outside of Newcastle, it could be in Newcastle. But anywhere in Newcastle is fine to meet as long as you have the specific place. And we meet here and we meet at the police station. And you can also meet at Jesse Captain if you want to. Right? Next slide, please. So you have to give at least 7 days notice of every meeting. That means the Board of Adjustment, that means the Planning Commission, that means the Tree Commission, that means the Park Commission. Everybody's got to give 7 days notice. You have to have an agenda. Next slide, please. So the only notice that matters under FOIA is the one that you put on the town hall, in front of town hall. That's the only one that matters. The website doesn't matter as far as FOIA for a municipality. For a state agency, it matters, but for municipalities, you can put it up on your website 14 days in advance. You don't put it on that bulletin board. The bulletin board is all that matters. And likewise, you didn't forget to put it up on the website. As long as it's on the bulletin board, that's all that matters. You have to say so if you're going to do a virtual meeting. Next slide. So you can have a special meeting on up to 24 hours notice. Like to do it if there's a true emergency. What would a true emergency be? If there's a hurricane that's coming down and it's going to plow into Newcastle and you need to do something, you can do it on 24 hours notice, right? Sometimes you can do that if there's a bad, like, employee situation or, you know, something unbelievably bad has happened. You can do it on 24 hours. But as a general matter, you got to give 7 days notice for every single meeting, unless you can say it's a true emergency. All right. And the agenda can change. I think that's the next slide. Or, you know, so the agenda can change. When can an agenda change? Well, you post your agenda 7 days in advance, and there's things that aren't ready or whatever. You can take those off. That's no problem under FOIA. Also, there are times when you can actually add things to the agenda, but there has to be a reason why 7 days notice could not have been given. So let me explain. In the law, if I got a judicial decision, I have 5 days in order to file a motion for re-argument with the court. So let's say I lost, right? Let's say it's on a Thursday, I lost. You guys had a council meeting on Tuesday, right? I have to respond in 5 days, no matter what. So I can't give 7 days notice of it, right? And you guys already have a council meeting scheduled. So I can, or I could call a special meeting if I need to, because I can't otherwise give 7 days notice, but I have to explain on the agenda why 7 days notice couldn't be granted, right? So in my hypothetical, council's gonna meet on Tuesday, I get the decision on Thursday. Antonina and I get together and say, yes, we need to discuss with council whether or not we want to file a motion for the argument. You would put it up, you would add it to the agenda, you would note the agenda isn't changed, and you would say, this is why 7 days notice can't be given. But that's the only reason. So like, for example, it's kind of easy in that situation for the council amendment, really almost impossible for the planning commission and board of adjustment to do the same thing, right? You're not gonna have that. Next slide, please. So this doesn't happen in Newcastle, but this happens all the time where people want to add an ordinance on less than 7 days notice. You can never add an ordinance on less than 7 days notice. Because that code has been the same for years and years and years. There is no 7 day emergency that should be changed. You always have to have 7 days notice to introduce that. You can, under specific circumstances, amend the agenda to have an executive session. And why is that? That's usually a personnel matter or something where something has come up or we need to have an executive session, like a threat of suit or whatever that may be, where there's a time crunch. You still need to explain on the agenda why you changed it and why it came up with less than 7 days notice. Next slide, please. And Antonina is used to this because she used to send me the agendas all the time. So you guys have been following this practice for a long time. What are minutes? You gotta take minutes at every meeting. So the statute only said the minutes have to have a record of who was there and the votes that were taken. Your minutes obviously stay way more than that for all the meetings. You guys do a great job, Newcastle does, right? You also have to take, minutes of executive sessions and you have to keep those. Those are generally completely shielded from view. Nobody can view them. But there are certain situations where executive session minutes they lose their confidentiality. Let me explain. If I come in and you have a legal problem and I give you legal advice in executive session about a board of adjustment matter, about something in council, I give you legal advice. That's cradle to grave. Those minutes will never be released. But what happens, take my Milton example. In Milton, they wanted to buy a piece of property, right, to do something. They might be looking at 2, 3, 4 different properties. If they did that in public, they would lose their commercial advantage of trying to buy that property because then people would prospect to it. So they can keep that confidential. But once they buy the property and put the pump station on it, those executive session minutes are no longer confidential because the reason for the confidentiality is no longer there. So somebody could get them later. So it just depends on what the thing is. So don't think simply because it's an executive session minute, it's never going to become public. It's going to become public. Also, sometimes when things are challenged that happen in executive session, that's the only record to show the AG's office that you did it right. Next slide, please. So let's talk about executive sessions. That's where you get to sit behind closed doors. Let me give you the rules. Here's when you can go in. Next slide. When you're holding an individual citizen's qualifications to do a job. That means when you're hiring somebody, you can go into executive session. It does not apply, for example, if you are interviewing a law firm for a solicitor position. Why? Because a solicitor is a contractor. Same with an engineer, same with everything else. I will say that it's very painful to be interviewed in this process in this way, but this is what we have to do. So anytime it's a contractor, that's not, but if you're gonna hire somebody, an example, the city of Rehoboth Beach recently had an opening for their solicitor position. They had 2 people who applied to be in-house that could be interviewed in executive session. They had 2 firms that applied. Both of those firms had to be interviewed in public session. So it's very different. Next slide. So strategy sessions is where most executive sessions come, when you have pending or threat of litigation, something of that. And pending or threatened litigation, we'll go through what that means in slides to come. But naturally, if you're getting advice from your lawyer or you're doing collective bargaining and get advice on that, you can go in, you can keep that out of the public. Why? Because it's going to have an adverse effect on the bargaining or litigation position of the public body. If they know your negotiation strategies, guess what? That's a problem. Next slide. So let's talk about that. So, Joe, you're gonna know, you're gonna be the one person who knows this. So every time the government takes an action, there's a chance it's gonna get sued, right? Possible, you're gonna get sued. That's not reasonably foreseeable litigation, which allows you to go into executive session. There's this guy, and he sued Newcastle County early in my career. That guy sued Newcastle County all the time. One time I had 38 cases with the same guy. He said his hobby was to sue Newcastle County. I heard him say, this guy loved to sue people. Well, guess what? Every time that guy had a project, I could go into executive session because I knew that guy was going to sue us, right? But that doesn't mean if somebody comes up to the podium every week and says, I'm going to sue you, 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 then you can go into executive session because then there's no credibility to that. So it's a long way. But so it's sort of a sliding scale of when it's permissible to go into executive session. If I got a letter from a law firm saying they were going to sue us, that's one way, right? Previous or existing litigation, that would do it. But it's got to be a realistic or tangible threat of litigation. And like all of these things, there's no clear, bright line. So next slide. Here's one. DelDOT had decided to turn down the acceptance of subdivision streets in a particular area. And the guy who FOIA'd them was a well-known plaintiff's side litigation land use attorney. So that's the guy who sued. So DelDOT said, nope, we're not giving it to you. That guy sues us all the time. We're not going to give you that stuff. And the AG's office said, no, you have to give them all that information. So they said it didn't satisfy that the litigation was reasonably foreseeable because he hadn't made a threat. And he said there must be a clear nexus between the requested documents and subject matter. He said you have to give it to him. They gave it to him. He turned around and sued DelDOT. But they were right ultimately that there should have been a threat, but that wasn't enough objective. Next slide, please. So what else is a public document? Right? You can go into executive session when something's excluded from the definition of public record. What would that be? Well, that would be attorney-client privilege memos. That would be medical or pupil files. That would be something by statute that's not a public record. We can discuss that. You have employee disciplinary counsels be heard, but the vote has to be in public. You can have where the names, competencies, and individual employees or students must be employees. So that's where if you had an employee issue, it would be under the last exception. Next slide, please. It's actually number 9. Great. So what happens when you go into executive session? And most folks will know that I say this every time I go into executive session, and because it's what the rules are. You have to vote to hold an executive session. It's got to be on the agenda, and you have to be specific about the statutory thing that applies. Next slide. I got ahead of myself, right? So here are the rules. You can't take any votes. You can't stray from the topic. So you can't go in and start talking about pending litigation and then start talking about an employee matter unless they're both on the agenda. Like you have to make sure that you can't stray. You can't have a straw poll. Why can't you have a straw poll? Because you're not supposed to vote in executive session. So I've seen this happen where you go in, there'll be 5 people. It never happened in the council. I've seen councils, 5 people. First person says, I think that this is how I would vote. The second person says, I think this is how I would vote. And I would be like, stop, because you can't have a straw poll within the executive session. So that all has to happen in public. So what are public records? And this is the most important thing. Everything is a public record. Look at that definition. Everything in the world is a public record, right? Whether or not, so that means emails, models in any way of public interest, regardless of the physical characteristic. So that's all kinds of stuff, right? That's what a public record is. So the only way so you assume everything's a public record, and then you look and see if there's an exception that applies. So let's go see what the exceptions are. One more. I'll tell you a funny story before we go back one slide. So I represented this little town. This little tiny town had this. They wanted to annex property. They were downstate, very poor town. And the developer, so they hired me to look at the annexation for these. So I go in, I said, yeah, so I looked at it and the annexation proposal. And the very first thing I did was write them a memo that said, what a terrible idea doing this annexation would be. That was my very first memo. I wrote it to them, I talked to them about it, I said, this is an awful idea. Well, they said, I wanna go forward anyway, because we need the tax base and we need all. I said, all right, I'll help you with the paperwork. My recommendation is not to do it, but you wanna move forward, that's fine. Wouldn't you know, we finally get to the hearing, we show up, and there is a room bigger than this, chock full of people. Like, I don't think there are 200 people who live in the town, but I think there were 300 people present. I mean, it was bad, right? And the first guy up to speak is the local state legislature. He's the first guy at the podium. He stands up and he says, you guys shouldn't do this. And even your own attorney told you, and reads my memo, where I told him that was a terrible idea. And I went to my client, I'm like, how did he get a hold of that memo? She's like, well, we just keep a paper file. So we throw everything in a paper file. He has to see the file. And so that was the worst thing that could have happened, right? In that situation. You gotta assume that everything you're gonna write is gonna end up in the newspaper. That goes for boards, commissions, whatever. If you're doing public business, and I do a lot of litigation. Joe, you know this, I do a ton of litigation. And we have to have electronic discovery. What we do in electronic discovery is we go flash the server, we collect all the stuff, and we have to run these searches and do all this stuff. So when you do that, then you get a cache of information. And the very first thing I do is I have a set of cuss words that I run against the database. And the reason I run the cuss words against the database is because they're going to be the worst documents I'm going to have to deal with. So rule, if you're a public official, don't cuss in email. Just don't do it. You're good. Don't do that, because that's but people do it all the time. So what's the rule that you're going to take home? If you want to cuss at somebody, call them up and make no record in writing. Okay, that's the rule for the. Okay. So you got to assume everything's going to become public. Next slide, please. So what's not a public record? So a personnel file or a people file, or trade secrets of commercial or financial information. So trade secrets are the hardest ones, because that trade secret information is usually somebody who's coming to the town who wants to do something, so they're giving you this stuff, and it's usually their determination of whether or not it's public. There was, you might remember this, Chris, in Newark, when they were building the pedestrian bridge across the Boy Clay, they had a set of bids that came in, and there were 4 bids and 5, and they wanted the design so they could put it up to the public and show everybody. Well, one of the bidders put all over that, confidential. I don't want this out there. This is trade secret, and we didn't know what to do. So we ended up having to actually rebid the project and say you can't have something that's confidential to do that, because the bidder, the eyes were the trade secret and commercial or financial interest was really in the person who was giving it to us, not in the designation. We didn't think that it was trade secret, but if they marked it, then we had to deal with that. So next slide, please. These are the police ones. Those criminal records, investigatory files, criminal files, intelligence files, they are all not public records, not subject to FOIA. Next slide. Any records specifically exempted from disclosure by statute or common law. So what is that? Well, there's a statute that says they're not public, but it's usually attorney-client privilege stuff most of the time, 95% of the time. I write you a memo that says X, Y, and Z. I haven't done too many of those for Newcastle, but I've done a few. Like, this is the way you should do it. Those are exempted. That's not my memo that got read by the state representative in that little town. That, well, should have been not disclosed. That was not a public record, right? People will give you money. Hopefully somebody gives you what Rehoboth gave. Somebody gave them $250,000 to repair a bridge or a pier. It's amazing. And they didn't want it to be public. Labor negotiations, next slide, please. Any documents relating to courts or basically relating to a litigation. So it used to be that I would go in, and if there was a litigation pending, you couldn't get that information through FOIA if you were the plaintiff. But then what the plaintiff would do would say, okay, and they would get their neighbor down the street who was unrelated to it, to the litigation, and request exactly the same stuff. And we would have to give it over to them. The courts have said, or the AG's office has said, look, that's not what the law is anymore. Once it's in litigation, you can't get it, it becomes a non-public, so you can't subvert the rules of FOIA. Margaret, don't fall asleep on me, it's FOIA, it's really fun. You always gotta pick on somebody in the crowd. No, you're next. Oh, come on. So, any records that disclose the, concealed carry permit, library cards, exempt, next slide. So this is my favorite one. Email sent or received by members of the General Assembly or their staff. Okay, so that is an automatic exemption from FOIA. And if you notice, but if they send a letter or a text message, it has to be to a constituent, right? And that actually came to pass in a case called Flowers versus Office of the Governor, where under the state system, the state agency has the right to appeal an AG's determination of FOIA. Municipalities do not have a right to appeal for whatever reason. I don't know. They all have the same rights, but here we are. And in that case, the state appealed it because it was an email that wasn't to a constituent, and the AG's office said, hey, you have to produce that email because I went to a constituent. And we took that case on behalf of the Office of Governor, and they said, and the courts ruled, hey, if it's an email, you don't have to produce it as part of that if it's the General Assembly or their staff. I will tell you that simply because you have a friend who is in or worked for the General Assembly is not going to get you out of everything. You can't just copy them on all those to avoid FOIA, right? That's not the spirit of the law. Next slide, please. So this is much more sort of in staff, so everybody knows what it, like you can have records open for inspection. We have records that are open for inspection. It does take a lot of the staff time because somebody has to watch. I've seen people try to take things out of files that shouldn't have been there. So you have to watch them if they're going to inspect. You guys have the FOIA request forms on your website. You should make sure that all FOIA request forms are in writing. If you get, and I know we've dealt with this many times, if we get a generalized FOIA request about, I want everything in the world about everything, they're allowed to ask and find out what they're really looking for. And if it's in storage, you guys have to go get it. Next slide. All right, so here's your quiz. I answered this earlier. Can public comment be limited?
Yeah.
Yes. Reasonable time, place, and manner. Are you required to answer questions under FOIA? Yes. The answer is no. You're not required to answer questions. You're required to provide the documents you have. You're not required to make one or do anything else. If you have a confidentiality clause in a settlement agreement, does that exempt you from FOIA? The answer is no. Confidentiality clauses are not governed by FOIA, and you have to produce them anyway. Can you go, I told you to go into executive session to interview somebody. Can you go in to discuss interview questions? The answer is no, because you have to talk about that human being at that time. Next slide, please.
Max,
Yes.
are you gonna talk about FOIA and emails, like for commission members?
They are subject to exactly the same things that I'm talking about. Everybody, commission members, all that stuff. You guys are all subject to FOIA for your public business, just like anybody else.
Okay, so somebody could theoretically subpoena
FOIA, any commission. It could be the planning commission members, it could be, yes, theoretically, they could FOIA. Any public body can be FOIA. I mean, if you have like, sometimes there's some really tiny, I don't think you guys have any really tiny committees in Newcastle, at least I can't think of one. But there are places that have little tiny committees, like committee to discuss the lighting in the community center, right? So they have this committee, it's appointed by council because somebody doesn't like the light, right? And so they have this committee. Well, then when the little old lady who's on the lighting committee gets FOIA, then they get really upset. But they are still subject to that. So, this was a real thing. The mayor at this particular town yelled at somebody, and then the next person came in and she said, you treated him like a pubescent son found with a porn magazine. The mayor said, get out, officer, remove that person. Was that deemed to be a FOIA violation? No, So that's not a FOIA violation, that was disruptive enough to get away. You can ask for additional time. Lord knows, sometimes FOIA requests are hard to get to, they're voluminous, they require attorney review, that kind of thing. You have to say why you're asking, why you need the additional time, like, hey, you can't just say, we're not responding to your request. You have to say why there's a need, right? The other thing is, are you required to respond to out-of-state requesters? Yeah. Nope. Nope, you are not required to respond to out-of-state requesters. They have to have an in-state address before we'll respond. So next slide, please. So you get a free hour, but you can anticipate, so the way it works is you get a free hour, it's gonna take longer than an hour, and most FOIA requests don't take an hour, most of them. But if it's gonna be longer than that, you have to bill it at a quarter of an hour and you have to give an estimate. You have to agree to pay the estimate or pay the estimate in advance of getting the documents in that situation, if you get an estimate. Next slide, please. So the Attorney General's office enforces FOIA. You can also bring a private FOIA suit. There's a couple different ways you can do that. 98% of the FOIA decisions are appeals to the Attorney General's office where they make a determination. There's a 60-day statute of limitations for public records denial, and there's a 6-month statute of limitations for like meeting violations. Like, you can't go back to a meeting we had 3 years ago and talk about, hey, you guys messed something up under FOIA. So it's the city's burden, if there's a FOIA, to say, hey, we did it right. It's not the complainers, it's our burden. So we have to do that by affidavit, and you have to do that by certain testimony. That's the way it works. Next slide, please. If there's a FOIA suit, then you can award attorney's fees and costs. If you actually had a suit that went all the way to trial, the elected members can enforce or can be required to forfeit their compensation. And it says that in the statute, it says the Attorney General's office can hear a prospective violation, something that you want to do, you want a voice from it, but they never do it. They refuse to do it. So you're on your own. We have to make the best guess that we can. So that's kind of through FOIA, the basics. You know, if it was a good time to stop and ask if there are any questions. Yes, ma'am.
I have heard, and I've been operating on this idea that if you have, let's say, a commission of 5 people, 2 people can get together and discuss stuff, because you're not in a quorum, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay.
So, but you gotta watch. So I guess my point. So let's take your example. 2 people want to discuss something perfectly fine, sub-quorum. But let's say you were like the Christina School Board, who appointed 2 people to go negotiate with the new superintendent, then that becomes different. So it just depends on what you're talking about and what you're charged with doing. Cynthia.
Just a clarification, you kind of went quick on this. Can you remove somebody from a public meeting for making a sort of approved comment, but it's not excessive?
Yes, you can, under that FOIA decision, you can.
Can remove them.
That, they said there was no FOIA violation. Yes,
To remove that person.
correct.
Okay, thank you, that's one.
Yep. Yep, and to be fair, if I'm sitting at council table, that happened, I would not let that person be. I think it's gotta go beyond that, but that's what the AG's office said. Sir?
During public comments, can a person be denied the opportunity to read a statement from someone who was unable to be at the public meeting?
So I have a difference of opinion with the way we do it in Newcastle. Personally, I think if there's a letter that should be submitted, you should read it. You guys read everything perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong. That person gets 3 minutes. So in other words, you can't write something that's 10 minutes long and read it in. That person gets 3 minutes just like anybody else. A lot of questions. I'm gonna go, hold on, there's somebody to read. Okay. Your minutes.
Okay, my question piggybacks on Cynthia's question, with regards to, individuals who are being disruptive at a meeting. We had a situation at the last planning commission where one of the people in the audience was like verbally attacked one of our commissioners, that person be removed at that point, or?
If it gets to a level and there's repeated violation of sort of decorum and others, that person can be removed. I'm hopeful, we haven't seen too much of that in Newcastle.
That was when.
Right, I mean, I think it might be a one-off, but I haven't seen too much of that in Newcastle. The one-off thing, you know, if there's one comment or something, or, you know, it's one of those things, I know when I see it, right, when it's gone too far, but I you know, it's a feel thing, so you gotta, you know, it's like when you're a kid in a playground, right, and you start, they sort of run into each other, and so that's not it, right, and then they start yelling at each other, well, that's not it, well, they're just short of throwing haymakers, yeah, that's when they need, it's kind of the same kind of thing.
My question is to follow up to Reverend Morris. Can person A make a public comment for 3 minutes and then say, I have a letter to read from person B and get 3 more minutes?
No. They can submit that letter under your rules.
Right.
That letter can be submitted by the person who wrote it. You guys will read it in. That's the way you guys.
Have to submit it by 3 o'clock the afternoon of the meeting as specified in the announcement. The person who is bringing it on behalf of the second person can't submit it.
That's my take, yes.
When you talk about virtual meetings and you had said if there's a technological problem, the meeting can go on. I assume that's not true if you lose your quorum, technological problem.
So I had this exact problem. What I did was, because we had a technological problem, I had 2 members online. I actually called them up and made them participate by telephone to keep my quorum. Whether or not that's copacetic, there was no law on that, but I figured I had all my people, they could hear and participate, so I let them participate. Anyway.
Your slide on minutes said that the only thing that needs to be reported in the minutes under FOIA are the names of those present and any actions or votes that were taken and voted. So discussions, public comments do not need to be reported in the minutes.
So I'm just saying what the statute says. Most folks put way more than what the statute requires in there. But, and I'll tell you, oftentimes I have to go to an executive session to do a presentation about something. There's nobody in there to take the minutes. So who do they make do the minutes? They make the lawyer do the minutes. Well, it's hard to make the presentation on the one hand and take the minutes on the other hand. So there's a rule of reason. So I try to document the best I can, at least have a paragraph about who said what and that kind of thing. I think that it can't be completely bare bones, but it doesn't have to be a verbatim transcript, certainly not that. Chris was next.
Yeah, Max, can you discuss briefly sort of at the end of a meeting where there's, banter, does anybody want to discuss anything else? How far can one go with something that's not specifically on the agenda before you're in violation?
So it's fine to bring up a topic, and so there's a continuum. It's okay, right, to say, I thank such and such for doing such and such for the town, or I recognize that such and such did this, or we had a great separation day, or that kind of stuff, fine. Let's assume though that there's a new topic that's brought up, let's say by a member of council, right? And member of council says, hey, we need to have an ordinance that does blank, right? And then the next council person says, yeah, we need to add to that, blah, blah, blah. That's where I cut it off, right? I just say, that has to be for a topic for the next meeting, you can put it on that agenda. So you don't wanna have, you can have say, hey, I wish Chris Rogers a happy birthday. That's fine, right? You say, I wanna give Chris Rogers a pay raise. That's not okay. Right?
Chris thinks it is.
Right, I know. Phil, you have a question? Phil, you had a question?
With executive session, at what point can minutes or information from that executive session be released?
Only in a situation like for attorney-client privilege, never, only if the council votes as a whole to release it. You can get into certain situations like the property example I gave, where you're buying property, you have those other properties, once they purchase the property, the reason for the executive session doesn't, it's not there anymore.
What about an agenda for the executive session?
Sorry.
You have, negotiations with union, employee potential.
We usually put those on the agenda here with the actual citation to go to what we're in executive session for.
And that's on, we're outside.
Cynthia?
Something that's frustrated me in the commissions I'm on is that we don't seem to have room on the agenda to bring up things to talk about in future meetings. And I think that hamstrings the ability to advance ideas, and not discuss them, to your point, but to say, I think, these are some topics like accessory dwelling units, we should put it on our next agenda. That doesn't seem to be possible without an agenda item. And I think we go in circles, and frankly, I think it slows down progress.
Okay, I mean, I'm just here to teach for it.
No, I know that, but I think what you're saying is that it's okay to have that kind of conversation.
I don't want you to have a public debate on topic
No,
that's
not
not on the
public
agenda,
debate.
I don't want you to have a public discussion, but
No.
otherwise, if it's just, I think X, part of comment, sure. No problem.
So could we have an agenda item that said roundup of topics for next meeting or something like that, just to make sure that everybody present can put topics out?
Yeah, from a FOIA perspective, yes.
Because otherwise, there is no way to do that. For commissioners, not, I mean, the leader of the commission makes the decision.
The work is harder though, Cynthia, from a FOIA guy's perspective. I go and I have an agenda, right, and I say, we wanna talk about X, right? Let's say, I'm gonna use what you said, the accessory dwelling units, right? And then we have another commissioner says, I don't wanna discuss accessory dwelling units. Right, and then they say, so then you get into that, and then the chair then calls for a vote on whether or not we want to discuss accessory dwelling units. And then that's a violation of FOIA, so it gets tricky, I understand your practical problem, I understand. So I think sort of bringing up a topic like that is okay, but there's limits to how far you can go.
Get it, totally get it, but otherwise, it's, you're stuck in whatever's on the agenda, you can never have a big deal.
Anybody else? Before I go on to ethics is quick, one more, Phil, before I go on to ethics.
When it comes to submitting a FOIA request, it's 15 work days unless there's an explanation given before. the
15 business days, you're exactly right.
Can it be on the day of that?
Yes, it's often is, yes.
And what's an acceptable extension, and would it be acceptable for all of the FOIA requests?
I've seen FOIA requests on the state level be extended out 4, 5, 6 months. So those were deemed acceptable.
Would that be something like if 4 separate subjects are submitted and all of them are extended?
Yeah,
Is that excessive,
no, it happens. It happens.
ongoing every time?
It happens. I mean, look, there's a lot of stuff that goes on. As long as it's voluminous records, attorney review. Look, sometimes you gather them up. And I'm gonna go outside of Newcastle because I'm trying to be a teacher here, right? And I'm trying to, so other places, like they'll be like, here's a tough one. 911 call, okay? 911 calls are sometimes avoidable and sometimes not. Depends. Not every time. Depends. Because it's part of a continuing investigation or something like that, then they're not. So you have to listen to those. Well, one jurisdiction gives me those on the 14th business day, right? Because they have to go find it and dig it up and do all, they get it to me on the 14th business day. I'm in court for 3 days. It needs attorney review. I'm sorry, we're gonna take an extension on that every single time. And I might have 3, 4, 5, 7 of those stacked up. I just can't get to it. So yeah, I think it's appropriate. Any other questions? Can we go on to ethics real quick, and I'll try to, I know you guys love listening to me, so I've been working on trying to keep it about an hour, so I'm close, we'll see what we can do, so you guys are subject to the Public Integrity Commission. If you go to the next slide, you guys do not have your own ethics. So municipalities can develop their own ethics board if they so choose to do so. You guys have not thus far chosen to do so. If you do adopt your own ethics board, it has to have the minimum requirements that are in the state code, they're your base, okay? So the state code, which is written for the state, applies to all municipalities, so if you read it, sometimes it's a little wonky as far as municipality. Next slide, please. Here's who is on the Public Integrity Commission. And so every time they vote, they have to have 4 affirmative votes. That's the most important thing. Next slide, please. This is what the Public Integrity Commission can do, right? It can recommend rules of conduct, they can investigate, they can subpoena witnesses, they can prepare manuals, they can administer financial disclosure. The most important one here, I think, is there's really 2. They can prosecute you for code of conduct violations, number 1. And they can issue advisory opinions. And since I'm not here all the time anymore, I'll say this. If there's something that's close to the line for an elected official about whether or not elected or appointed official about whether or not they should participate, your first line of defense is the solicitor to sort of determine that. But sometimes, happens rarely, you go ask to pick because you just don't know the answer or there's not something about it. It's a lengthy process to go to pick, so you need to know ahead of time. Next slide, please. Here's what conflicts of interest are. You can't participate in a matter where you have a personal or private interest. What's a personal interest? Well, my very tall sister cannot sit in if I'm voting on something, right? I can't vote on her application. And it gets trickier. What if it's your cousin? What if it's your second cousin? What if it's your third cousin twice removed? Right? So it gets very gray in that instance. And you're probably closer with your best friend than you are with your third cousin twice removed, right? So what if it's your best friend? How do you determine if it's your best friend? So there's a lot of that goes on. And the test that's applied is whether or not there's an appearance of impropriety. And I will tell you, the appearance of impropriety for one is not the appearance of impropriety for another. That is a subjective standard. So it depends. And we try to put some rules around that, right? Here's what it is. If your personal or private interest, right, you can't have a financial interest in it at all, but if your personal or private impairs your judgment, like it's your sister, your brother, like you're gonna make $10,000 on the transaction, whatever that means, you should not be participating. Next slide, right? So they define what an impairment of judgment is, right? When the officer will receive a financial benefit, right? Or a financial interest. So let's not pick on counsel, which I've done all night. Let's say it was something that Antonina's brother, cousin, sister, whatever, is coming into account. Antonina would need to screen herself from that and would have to delegate the responsibility to handle that application to somebody else. It happens. It happens every once in a while. You just have to be, and generally you're supposed to provide notice to the PIC, but generally if you're screened, you're okay. So that's I'm done, right? Like, I hear that. So next slide, Antonina. You can't represent people, right? Like, so Brian can't represent somebody before the Board of Adjustment because he's on council, or sort of assist people. This doesn't mean that you can't assist somebody that comes into town and needs some help with something. But I'm talking around sitting around kitchen table and doing strategy and all of that stuff. That's not what it's about, right? So this 10% rule, I think I got type it, sorry, 10% rule. So this 10% rule is bogus because they always use the appearance of impropriety standard. So don't even think about it. The idea is that if you're in stock in a public company, they don't want you to be disqualified from something. But generally, most of the conflicts that we see are with LLCs or our local companies. Next slide, please. Right? So, and there's a 2-year impairment after it's over if you gave an opinion about, investigated, or were directly responsible for. That's why all the DelDOT engineers, they work for DelDOT, they get their pension, they go to Maryland for 2 years, and then they come back. Happens all the time. And they work in private practice. Next slide, please. Right? Disclosure of confidential information, right? Is a violation of the PIC. So if we go into executive session And this happens, I've seen it happen, we go into executive session, I give you a memo. And in certain towns, that memo is around town 2 minutes after the executive session ends. That is a violation of the PIC statute, right? So those are important in the next slide, please. Let's talk about the code of conduct. If you're a public official, and most of the people in this room are public officials by virtue of your election or your appointment, you shouldn't act in a way that makes it look like you violate the public trust. And again, it's that appearance of impropriety standard, right? So if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's a duck. So, next slide. Just don't take gifts. There's no de minimis gift giving thing in Delaware. And I always said, I could buy you a beer, maybe I can buy you a sandwich, but I can't take you out to the bordea, right? There's an amount which is too much, right? And even if it's a small thing, if it impairs your judgment or results in preferential treatment or results in government decisions, right? Or affects the public, that's when you do it. So, funny story. I talked about the guy who sued Newcastle County all the time earlier. And my daughter was young, she's now 22, but at the time she liked this chocolate, I can't even remember what it was. So this guy who sued Newcastle County, right about Easter, he comes in on a Monday and finds out that my daughter had like this chocolate. So he sends me the biggest thing of chocolate you've ever seen in your life. It was a basket, it was enormous. And I wrote a nice letter to his attorney. I said, I can't accept this. This is a gift. And I sent it back. For 5 consecutive days, that guy sent me the biggest thing of chocolate because he wanted me to take it, right? So he could hold it against me. Well, on the 5th one, I wrote it back to his attorney and I said, if this guy sends me another basket of chocolate, I'm taking it. I don't hear a word about it. Never sent me another thing of chocolate. So anyway, but you look, I'm not a public official, but I represent a lot of them, and you don't want to do things that impair the public confidence in what you're doing, right? So if it looks sneaky, it looks sleazy, don't do it. Next slide. So don't use there's all kinds of stuff within this thing, but don't use your office to secure unwarranted advancement, privilege, or anything. I know of a mayor in Delaware who goes to a particular bar who never ever pays a bar tab. I know that mayor. I know who it is. I know the bar, right? That's not right, right? Because they're trying to say, well, if something happens, I'll look after you. No, you can't do that, right? So, and the other thing is confidential information. If you got somebody's trade secret stuff, you can't just like send it out there. If you got an attorney-client privilege memo, like my little town when they gave away my memo, that's a violation of statutes. It's not part of the code of conduct, right? Next slide, please. So, and how far does that go? So this guy, he was on the town council, and there was some historic artifact that wasn't done. So let's say, I don't even know what it was, but let's say it was a historic stone or sword or something, right? So he's like, oh, I'd like to have that. And he asked the town, will you give it to me? And they were like, no. And then they tried to value it to see if the guy could buy it. They couldn't value it, so he asked again. So they went to the PIC. And the PIC said, because he wanted to make it a gift, that was already impairment of judgment by asking for the artifact to be given to him. That's impairment of judgment, right? You can't give it to the official rather than open it up to the public, right? And if trying to give that thing to a public official had the appearance of impropriety. So these are the kind of standards we have to look at, and we have to evaluate our conduct on. Next slide, please. So you can get waivers, right? You can go down to the PIC and you can ask for a waiver. That happens sometimes. We have not had an occasion to require a waiver in Newcastle in my tenure here. I've been here 2 years, 2.5, 3 years. Wow, it's been fun. The written requests are generally confidential. Next slide, please. You can request an opinion, right? Next slide.
Can you start us in, am I the only person who doesn't understand why you would ask for a waiver or advisory?
Sure, you would ask for an advisory opinion on a super close call on something. And generally waivers are for people with the state who have a matter that they worked on, which they're precluded by statute to come back on, but they need to be on that project. So for example, let's say I was a DAG, and I worked on a state case, right? And then I went into private practice. There would need to be a waiver for me to continue to work on that case. I couldn't just take it with me, so I have to do it. So that's the waiver. The advisory opinions, I'll give you an example of an advisory opinion. There was a guy, I know what town it is, I won't say what town. He gets elected to council. The town had a rather large police force, let's say 50, 60, 70 people on the police force. His son-in-law was like a private, or I don't know the ranks, but like a just starting out officer. And he said, well, wait, my son-in-law has an interest in the budget for the police. So he said, well, I should be able to vote on that. I mean, he's just one of 60 or 70 officers in this department. But he said, just to be safe, I'm gonna ask for an advisory opinion. And so he went to the PIC and said, I want an advisory opinion. The PIC said, no, you can't vote on the police budget in that particular case. I would have said he could, so that was the right thing to do to get an advisory. So those are some examples of where that happens. Look, nobody in my firm wants to defend this town in front of the PIC on a formal complaint, okay? It's terrible. It's like a trial. Can you go back one, Anthony? Next slide. Right? You can have a complaint. Sometimes they're usually dismissed as frivolous. I think I have a slide in here. Next one, right? You're getting into a trial procedure to determine if you violated the ethics rules. It's a terrible procedure. It's hard on the town, it's hard on everybody else, right? It is like a criminal trial, and there's an appeal of the Superior Court. A famous opinion where I was a witness in one of these hearings, and it's the only time I've had to deal with that. And it was not a fun experience, right? So it was fine. My client ultimately didn't get one at the Superior Court level, but it was a lot of time and money and effort. Let's not have conduct that rises to the level that you have a prosecutorial hearing. That's why we're here today to train. Next slide, please. So what are the consequences under this? Next slide, right? They can issue a reprimand. They can remove non-elected employees, that's appointed people. They can they can recommend but not remove elected officials. Next slide. They can have sanctions, right? Administrative sanctions for confidential information, misuse of public office, or certain gifts, but if it rises to the next level, next slide, right? You can actually get up to a year in jail and $100 or $10,000 fine if you violate one of these rules. I will tell you that I am not aware of a single human in Delaware in my 25 years of practice that has ever gone to jail or ever paid a fine like this. But it's still out there, right? It's not something to do like, this would be is if you rigged a contract in favor of somebody who is your friend for a massive amount of money, then the contract would be voidable, then you would have prison. Some of the later violations won't go there, right? It's voidable if within 30 days of when the agency knew or should have known of the violation. That's why you do bids and things. So next slide, please. So I do ethics pretty quickly, so I'm going to summarize it for you. Appearance of impropriety. Look at it and you think that, boy, that is all right, then you need to recuse. I can sum up it. If you always go there, and if it's a close call, and I'm asking, I'm gonna tell you, you're gonna have to recuse. So that wouldn't, has to be a not close call for me not to take a recuse. Because why? You take an action, I'm speaking to council now or the planning commission. You take an action and one person improperly participated, one individual, but the rest of council was clean. It taints the entire body and the whole thing gets overturned. So one individual kills everybody else. They all die together in that. Are there any further questions on the ethics? So I did not get done in an hour, but I did get done in an hour and 5 minutes. So I appreciate you guys listening to me, and I'll hang around in case you guys have any questions.
Next time you do the numbers on your slide.
Yes.
I live there.
Thank you.
What's that?
I said, right now, Scott, you're talking about. Tell everybody. Guys, thanks.
No brainer.
Are you leaving?